Hello and welcome to this Relocate Global Think Women event for International Women's Day. And today we're talking about why purpose is so important for women now. And I'm delighted to be joined by Fiona Murchie. Of course, she's managing editor of Relocate Global. I'm Jane Constantinis, and our special guest is Sarah Rozenthuler. Now, Sarah is a chartered psychologist, a leadership consultant, and an author. Her passion is inspiring leaders and strengthening organizations to help them become forces for good. She spent at least 15 years consulting for global blue chip organizations. Her latest book is Powered by Purpose. That came out last year. She's also written about life-changing conversations. And she spent 4 years as a fire juggler. More on that to come later. Fiona and Sarah, welcome.
Thank you.
Lovely to see you. Thank you for joining us, Sarah. I wonder if we can begin with that word, purpose. What does it mean and why is it important?
Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be here talking about purpose. And just to go to purpose at a personal level to start with, really we could keep it simple and say it's what wakes us up in the morning with a spring in our step. So when we're on purpose, we feel engaged and energized with what we're doing. And at an organizational level, and there's this growing movement around organizations wanting to be more purpose-driven. It's about the organization having a meaningful and enduring reason to exist that contributes to long-term well-being.
You've mentioned spring in the step. Some of us have struggled with that, certainly in the last year. You make it sound easy, is it?
I'm all for keeping things simple. And we could think of purpose as our North Star, if you like. That's one of the metaphors that's sometimes used. But I think in the cut and thrust of daily life, and as women with the different things that we're juggling in our daily lives, work, homeschooling, looking after the kids and so on, I actually think seeing our North Star and then following it is a real challenge. So it's both really fulfilling when we're able to do it, and it is challenging.
And talk us through, if you would, your personal experience. When was your moment of awakening, if indeed there was one, about purpose?
It was really, I think, in my mid-20s. Looking back, it's easier to see these things with the benefit of hindsight. So my story is that I did a psychology degree and specialised in organisational psychology. I had the good fortune of landing a job in a top global consultancy. And in the year that I did that work, I saw that I really loved applying insights from psychology to increase performance and well-being at work. And then in my early 20s, I thought I want to broaden my horizons, live abroad, go and learn a new language. So I took off in a camper van and went to Spain, and I thought I'll teach English for a year. But fell on hard times. So the camper van was broken into. I lost really all of my possessions. I didn't get a job teaching English. And so I set about learning to busk and learning to juggle so I could literally pass the hat, and had a way of earning some cash, which meant I didn't have to phone my parents and come back to the UK with my tail between my legs. That adventure lasted for 4 years, and I ended up being able to do a good street show and having a good life, living on the road, traveling from fiesta to fiesta. And this is what brings us on to purpose, really. Deep inside, I noticed I really wasn't feeling fulfilled. And that feeling of, I'm not really on track here, really built up. And I ended up feeling quite depressed, quite down. And that was the catalyst for coming back to the UK, where it then took me a good year to find a job back as a psychologist, because psychology had become a popular degree subject by then. But I did find a job in the civil service working as a psychologist. And over time, I noticed that the light started to come back on side, because I was doing work that felt meaningful for me. So that was the life lesson that I had.
That's an amazing story. Fiona, what about you and circus skills? What would you have in mind? What would you fall back on? Trapeze, maybe?
No, well, I didn't ever have any circus skills, but I mean, it did remind me of when I was young. I used to force my family and visiting cousins to do all sorts of little productions, and I've sort of evolved into these webinars and events. And I'm quite happy to sort of organise it and then hand over to the real star performance. But I'm sure my 10 and 8-year-old cousins would have said I was very bossy in these productions.
Oh yes, that interesting word, bossy. But Sarah, it sounds as if you have always been rather an entrepreneurial person. To even decide to go to Spain and learn a new language and teach English. Most women are not like that. Most women are having to pay the bills, and they're on the hamster wheel, and they get up each morning without a spring in their step, and they don't expect it. Is this achievable, or is this a bit of a luxury?
I think many women could identify with the hamster wheel. I think part of the challenge for us women is that we tend to put ourselves last as well. We often feel last on the list. Yeah. You know, after our kids, after our partner, after our parents, you know, the people that we really care about. And I think one of the things that means is that we're at risk of overlooking our feelings and what's going on inside us. And when we don't pay attention to that, then we might stay on the hamster wheel and not take the risks that it does require to reach out. And it might be for something as simple as a conversation with somebody who's doing some work that we feel drawn to. But I think it really begins with us valuing ourselves.
And that is something that has really been a problem during this pandemic, hasn't it? We've seen a lot of evidence about how women have shouldered a disproportionate burden of all that's been going on. You mentioned homeschooling and domestic chores and so on.
Yeah. And I think, you know, the thing about purpose is that actually it can help us navigate that to some extent, because my own experience is by getting clear about what feels like mine to do, if I could put it like that's another way of thinking about purpose, then it actually has helped me to make decisions that, you know, actually I'm not going to stay in that organization where I feel my values are being compromised, or I'm not going to stay working with that boss where I'm feeling put down. And so I ran a program recently, and there was a participant on the program. We were looking at purpose-led leadership, and she had a wonderful way of putting it. She said, "Purpose is my anchor. It's greater than my fear." But what a wonderful way to think about purpose, because it could help us call up our courage, make some decisions, and do some reaching out.
We're obviously here for Think Women. Do you see a difference, because you work with men and women, do you see a difference between men and women in this regard?
I mean, I do think that men, and I'm going to stereotype a little bit here, are more comfortable with going after what they want. And maybe that's because they carry less of the responsibilities sometimes for the childcare or the home care. So maybe they can be more singular in their focus. But I do think that as women, we have the capacity to really tune into ourselves, how we're feeling. Women are often good at drawing on the support of other women and their networks. And it can sometimes be by talking things over with a trusted friend or a neighbour or a relative that we can get clear in our own minds, hey, I need to make a change here, or what if I actually sent that email off and made an inquiry?
Yes.
There are real resources we can draw on as women as well.
Yeah. Fiona, you're nodding. Is that something you've experienced in your life as a professional woman, also managing a family?
Well, it's a while ago since I had the family at home, but I mean, I think one of the main things I felt that was important was not giving up work ever at all. I was lucky enough to manage the number of hours I did and had that flexibility by having my own business. And I think that's become very much more on trend, and particularly after the COVID situation. People are working flexibly, they're working from home, but also people are looking at setting up their own businesses or building on the skills they've got, and looking beyond this year that we've had. So I think that's been really quite a change.
And I think, Sarah, you're absolutely right about how supportive women are to other women. I can bring to mind immediately conversations with women who have a friend of mine who was thinking of going for a particular job, thinking of getting back into the workplace. And I said, but you're brilliant. You're fantastic. I mean, you just will get this, and you, of course, must go for it. And I think those sorts of conversations do happen between women. You're fabulous. You're brilliant. You're amazing. Go for it. And then they do. And of course, she got the job, and the rest is history. So yes, drawing on our support network is important. Why then is it so important right now as we are hopefully coming out of the pandemic?
Well, it's interesting how much the pandemic has changed things, and I think it's had a real impact on work as well. And I think in the time, maybe the greater time that many of us, not all of us, but many of us have had at home, we've had time to maybe reflect a little bit more or become aware that what we were doing wasn't working so well. And so I'm seeing a real appetite amongst people for more meaningful work. There's an opportunity here to take stock and reflect. And I think wider than that, in society, the public is becoming less tolerant of companies that profiteer from this crisis. And I think there's increasing pressure actually on companies and on leaders to have organisations that are contributing to long-term well-being, that are becoming a force for good. So we've got two trends running alongside one another there at the individual level and at the organisational level.
Yeah. So Sarah, tell us about the book. And I'm sorry that your picture's a little bit fuzzy. I'm sorry about that. We've lived with this, haven't we, for a year, the vagaries of the internet connection. Tell us about the book.
Oh, I'm delighted to. So the book is called Powered by Purpose. The subtitle is Energise Your People to Do Great Work. And it's really picking up on a growing trend. And what's happened in the last 10 years or so is that we're seeing companies, large and small. So a large company would be Unilever, for example, who are purpose-driven. So in Unilever's case, it's about making sustainable living commonplace. And what's interesting is that they're getting strong financial results as let's say, as an outcome of following that purpose. And so this is getting attention in the business world. And a turning point for me was I read an article in the Financial Times that was saying, but the leadership of these companies is a bit of a black box. We don't really understand how these companies like Patagonia, Unilever, Whole Foods are getting these results. So I wanted to write about the leadership capacities that would enable leaders to really enliven their people, make work meaningful, and then, deliver excellent profits as well. And so at the heart of the book, I write about these 4 capacities that have come out of a review of the leadership literature, but really my own experience working on the corporate pitch, noticing what works and what doesn't work for leaders and leadership teams.
Give us a couple of tangible examples then of what you're referring to here when you're talking about this sort of leadership.
Yeah, well, the first capacity, if I just focus on maybe 1 or 2 of them, I call it cultivate leadership presence. And we've been kind of talking in that territory already today. So it's really about being present to oneself and then to the other people that we're interacting with. So noticing and paying attention to how we're feeling, or if we're getting distracted, bringing our attention back. Because I think we only really engage and energize other people when we're fully in the room ourselves. And it links to purpose, because I think it's only when we've got a more embodied sense of what's enlivening for us that we can tune into our North Star. That's one capacity. And another one is I write about make dialogue authentic. So that's about growing the capacity to have the conversations that matter most, where there might be some hard truths to acknowledge, there might be some difficult decisions to be made, but talking in a way that is inclusive, where we listen to all the different voices in the room and draw on that collective intelligence to make the best decisions that we can.
Fiona, you're a great fan of the book. I know you have a copy there right in front of you, don't you?
Yeah.
Not a coincidence.
I was sent a review copy at the end of last year, and have been dipping into it ever since, and put Sarah down as someone we must contact for International Women's Day. And yes, I think it's excellent because it gives you really good summaries. It's very evidence-based. You know what you're doing at the end of each chapter, and there's wonderful reading that you can do and build on things. And I think you very much can dip into something. It's not as if you have to read it from start to finish. And I would have thought anybody dipping into this, no matter where they are in a management structure, whether they're a junior or senior, is going to get something out of that and refer it up to it, because it makes a real lot of sense, and all that authenticity is great. And you just pull everything together in one place, which is wonderful.
Sarah, you had you call them the lost years, don't you? That was you were young then. I'm wondering if women in particular can find their purpose, can find that light inside of them at any point, because some might be feeling a little bit worn down by having been on the hamster wheel for a number of years and feel that they just can't get off.
Yeah, well, I think we can start small. And I'll give you one example from my own experience, which is, it's a number of years ago. And so I was back working as an occupational psychologist. And I noticed that I went home one day from work and I felt really energized in a way that I didn't on other days. And I was curious about that. And I wondered why it was. And then I figured out it's because on that particular day, I'd run a focus group. And it was the first time I'd run a focus group, whereas typically a lot of what I actually ended up doing in my civil service role was writing reports and running statistical analyses, making sure recruitment tests didn't adversely impact women or people from a minority background. And it was worthwhile work, but it didn't really light me up. But the focus group experience did. And I paid attention to that. And nothing happened immediately. But maybe a year or so later, I thought, I'm going to go and just take a day's training on coaching skills. So I went and did that. That was really energizing. And so without going into the whole story, I think if we pay attention to what our own energy levels are doing and just start small and be willing to just take the next step, that can actually be the beginning of our journey to become more purpose-led.
I think that's so interesting because you're describing it there as a journey. So you paid attention, you made a mental note, and then it took a year for you to actually do something about it. I wonder if younger people are perhaps too impatient to find purpose immediately in their careers. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm all for being more purpose-driven, and yet I think there are things we can do in our day-to-day work and day-to-day lives that help. And so there's an academic at London Business School, and he's got this notion of he calls it local meaning. And that's all about how do we just find a bit more meaning in what we're already doing. So we might, for example, say to ourselves, who are my beneficiaries? Who's really benefiting or potentially benefiting from the work that I'm doing? Is there any way I could have a bit more contact with them or find out a little bit more about the positive impact that my work is having? Could I ask them the question, is there any way I can help you more? To just make things a bit more meaningful, just where we are actually, without having to necessarily change our role or change our organisation.
I think that's really, really good advice, that we can do small things. And what about women in particular who during this pandemic have had to put their own careers, in some cases their jobs, on hold, put that aside because their beneficiaries that really didn't have needed them are at home?
Yeah.
How to get back to where they should be now?
Yeah. Well, I think, with the changes happening soon coming as lockdown begins to release, I really hope and encourage women to make the most of any opportunity they've got to have a little bit more time to themselves. Maybe there is an opportunity to have a conversation, to send off that job application. Often, I think if we just take a moment, we could think about our radar. What's our radar picking up about what's interesting us? It might be a magazine article we've read or a radio show that we've listened to. We might think, I'm actually really interested in, I don't know, helping other women in technology, for example, and just sending out some feelers without needing anything to happen immediately. But those small steps are what keep our energy mobilized. And even if we just do a tiny thing, when we can, it keeps us with that sense of forward movement.
And it might be a cup of coffee on a park bench as of next week to talk about that potential job. What would be your very practical advice for people? Something that they could do, apart from obviously organising the coffee on the park bench, that they could do right now to help move forward slightly?
Yeah, well, this is slightly left field in a way, but it's a starting point. And it's a bit of a fun activity I do with some of the leadership teams or the teams I work with, is to think about a possible job title for yourself in a way, and it might just be imaginative for the moment, that just lights you up. So when I've done this with different teams, the finance director has said, well, actually, I'm queen of the bank. Or the director of partnership, she said, I'm chief meerkat. I had a CEO say, I'm the chief cheerleader. So how might you think about yourself in a way that has some fun to it, but also reflects who you are, what you're about, and maybe that unique kind of little bit of magic that you bring? So that's just a bit of a exercise to reflect on for yourself. But actually, there's some research that shows that teens who go through that exercise actually go on to perform better, because it gives people an insight into unique contributions in a team. And I think once we're thinking about ourselves in a way that feels energizing, that helps our confidence lift, then I would say just take one practical step. So it could be make a phone call, it could be sign up for that webinar, and maybe it's an hour's webinar and you can only stay for 30 minutes or 20 minutes, but do something active, a next step that goes in that direction of this is who I am and this is what I'm about.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. And I think what's come across very strongly that I hadn't even thought of, it's about listening to yourself, listening and making a note, and maybe nothing happens immediately, but understanding why you're feeling what you're feeling and what prompted it and what is turning that light on inside of you. So when you look forward, post-pandemic, are you optimistic that more people are going to be able to find this purpose, that women in particular are going to be able to make up for a bit of lost time?
Overall, I am optimistic. I think it might involve perhaps each one of us redefining what success is for us. It might involve us accepting a more simple life. But again, I think there's real opportunity in that, that in a more simplified life, we could find the things that are meaningful for us. And just coming back to the book for a moment, I wrote Powered by Purpose, partly as an act of hope, if I can put it like that. I think there's such a narrative going on that's critical of leaders, and we can all point to, you know, the macho leaders that frustrate us, or the examples of bad leaders, or we ask the question, where have all the good leaders gone? And actually, there are some superb leaders out there in organisations. And I really wanted to write about the success stories and the ways that leaders can behave that's engaging and energising for others. I think the pandemic has brought purpose more and more into the spotlight, and all of that leaves me feeling more buoyant and optimistic about the future.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Well, you've certainly put a light on around this topic. It's been a delight chatting to you. Thank you very much for your time. Fiona, I'm sure you agree, the light is on. Would you like to give us some final words?
Yes, well, thank you very much for that, Sarah. I mean, you've encapsulated the reason why we introduced our Think Women group, and it's an evolving community, welcoming people who want to define what we do and what they need to support them. And as you say, enabling people to do those little steps and throw in all sorts of ideas and moves forward. And the other thing, obviously a lot of our community are international, and I noticed in the book as well, a lot of your examples are international organisations, and that can be really quite tricky. It's an extra complexity if people want international experience. So thank you very much indeed for bringing that in.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Fiona, and thank you, Jane. It's been a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jane, as ever. You've been a wonderful host today and some very insightful questions. So our thanks to Sarah, and there's details of the book, and please do take a read of it and pass on the information to people in your organisation too. As I mentioned, we're Relocate Global and Think Global people. We are a multimedia, and we have a wealth of information and resources for you to dip into. And we'll continue with leadership programs and webinars throughout the year. So thank you very much. Please do join us again. And for the rest of our celebrations for International Women's Day, there are more videos, webinars, and resources and articles on our website. So do enjoy them, not only for this International Women's Day, but throughout the year. So my thanks again to Jane and Sarah for joining us today.